We're thrilled to have everyone here. Welcome to Ask the Expert. If you're joining us remotely with your video camera, please make sure you've silenced, muted yourself if you haven't, so everyone can hear our expert today. And I'd like to welcome her, Aline Lerner. Aline is the co-founder and CEO of Interviewing.io. Before that, she wrote code and ran hiring at Udacity. So we're thrilled to have her back with us today. Welcome, Aline. I'd like to start by asking you to introduce yourself a little bit more and maybe share what drove you to start Interviewing.io and how you're making a difference.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm so excited to attempt to answer all of your hard-hitting questions about interviewing. I used to be an engineer. Then I was an engineering manager. Then I worked as a recruiter. I worked in-house, which means that I helped companies recruit for themselves, and I was at Udacity as well, which I'm really proud of. And then I ended up starting my own technical recruiting firm. And one of the things that always really annoyed me when I was on all these different sides of the table was just how unfair and unmeritocratic hiring seemed to be. So a lot of the time, you think of engineering, especially, for people that are just getting into this field, you're probably getting into it because it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a good engineer, you're going to be able to succeed. And that's something I want to believe, but in reality, it's not always that way. One of the things that was really frustrating for me is when I look at a resume, I just couldn't tell who's good, right? And the only way I could tell is if I actually interviewed the person. And even then, it's not that reliable, but at least you get some signal. What really was frustrating is when I was a recruiter later, I would present candidates that I knew were good to companies, because I had personally interviewed them, and maybe I'm not a great interviewer, but I try. And I'd put my personal stamp of approval and I'd send it to like some of the top companies in the Valley, and they'd be like, we don't want to talk to this person because they didn't go to one of this set of 5 schools, or they didn't work at Google or Facebook, or, a handful of other companies that we recognize. And that seems so short-sighted, especially in the age of Udacity and other MOOCs, where like enrollment in MOOCs and boot camps is growing exponentially, right? And enrollment in traditional computer science programs is growing linearly and not even like that fast. It's like that. So like credentialing is going to look really different in the space soon. And it just seemed stupid that we were just relying on these proxies rather than looking at what people actually could do. So I wanted to change that. What Interviewing.io does, and the way we try to solve this problem, is we have a practice pool where anybody who is a software engineer can start practicing technical interviewing with another person. And the cool thing is it's completely free and it's anonymous. So if you're an engineer, you can get on our platform, grab a time slot, and then get paired with a senior engineer from companies like Google and Facebook and Dropbox and Airbnb and a bunch of others. And they don't know who you are, and they'll run you through a pretty rigorous, hardcore technical interview. At the end, you get feedback. And then if you do well in these practice interviews, no matter how you look on paper, you can unlock our real pool, which is, essentially our jobs page, where you can look at all the companies we officially work with. And these companies include companies like Quora and Jane Street and Uber, Twitch, Lyft, and many others. And you can book a real interview with these companies that's still anonymous. So these companies will talk to you no matter who you are, because you've done well in practice, and they will weigh that more than how you look on paper. That makes me really proud. That's kind of what we were trying to do, and that's what we do now. It's hard, but we're getting more and more traction, which is really exciting. The last thing I'll say, and this is the statistic that my favorite thing to quote about our company, is that 40% of our top performers, the people that can book interviews with companies, and then by extension, 40% of the hires that we've made to date are people that are non-traditional on paper. And in many cases, they're people that have actually applied to these companies, got rejected at the resume screen before they could even do an interview. And then they sort of came in through the Interviewing.io backdoor, so to speak, did well in practice, booked interviews with these companies, got hired, and then these companies kind of have to do a bit of soul searching and say, I reject these people, right? And these are the kinds of hard conversations we want to force. So that's a long answer to a short question, but that's what we do, and that's why I do it.
That's a great answer, actually, and it's so exciting that you're actually changing the landscape and how this hiring process is done, because I think everyone knows that it's flawed as it stands right now, and it's fraught with error. A lot of companies turn down people that would be great employees. So I think it's wonderful that you're helping to bridge that gap between what people can do and what they come across as being able to do in an interview. So it sounds like your process is somewhat different from the usual technical interview process. I think it would be helpful if you could go through with us with your expert knowledge of what the technical interview process looks like for someone. So just give an overview snapshot of what that looks like.
So this is going to be kind of a simplified version. Like, your mileage may vary, especially for those of you that have applied to companies. And sometimes this moves quickly. Sometimes it can go really slow. Some big companies will take months to get you through their process. Some smaller ones can do stuff in a matter of a week. Typically, one way or another, a recruiter will get your resume. So in hiring, we have two terms. There's a term called inbound, and then outbound. So inbound means people that are applying to your company. So you'll go on a company's jobs page and maybe write some like crappy cover letter and submit your, I'm sure yours are all great, and submit your resume. That's inbound. Outbound is when a company's sourcers, so these are people that the company hires to actually go out there and try to contact you and hit you up on LinkedIn and over email and say, hey, rah, 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 you should go work at Acme Corp. You know, it's going to change your life. We'll give you all the money, whatever. So either way, one of those ways you get in through the door. As an aside, applying online almost never works because nobody really looks there because it's such a noisy channel. Like in this market, there's a shortage of good engineers, which is probably why a lot of you are getting into this field. So that's great. But that means that people just don't look there a lot. So if you don't hear back from a company, and we can touch more on that later, it's probably not because you suck. It's because their process sucks, and everyone's process sucks. But either way, let's say you were fortunate enough to get reached out to, or you somehow managed to scream into the black hole of applying online and actually got a response. At that point, you'll probably speak to a recruiter, and it'll very likely be a non-technical conversation. So they'll be asking you a little bit about what you've done, what you want to do, what you've worked on. They might be behind the scenes assessing to see if you're a jerk or not, which hopefully you are not. And they may also ask you about salary expectations, and we can talk about like how to handle that. I think we're going to discuss that later. You shouldn't tell them what you want, but we'll touch on that. But after you talk to a recruiter, assuming that goes well, you'll probably do what's called a technical phone screen. In some cases, you may get a homework assignment instead, but in a very vanilla process, the next step will be a phone screen, and there you will talk to an engineer. If it's a small company, it may be an engineer on the team where you'll end up. If it's a bigger company, it may just be an engineer that works there whom you will never see again. But either way, there's going to be an engineer on the other end. You show up. There's going to be some kind of collaborative coding environment. A lot of companies use a tool called CoderPad. We use it inside of Interviewing.io as well. It's awesome, but no matter what tool you use, I think Google still uses Google Docs, which is kind of weird, but the idea is that you're going to be writing code, and somebody is going to be sort of breathing down your neck and looking over your shoulder and asking you to solve problems and, you know, changing things up and just watching you do this. And there'll probably be an audio component as well. Maybe there's a video component so they can like watch you look uncomfortable. But they'll, you know, typically these things last 45 minutes to an hour. It may be one question, it may be several, but in most of that, you're going to be writing code. You'll probably talk a little bit about your past projects, but that part like cynically doesn't matter as much as you being able to write code well. And then at the end of that, if you do well, you go on site, and that means you spend the entire day at the company. If you're good, they'll feed you. They'll feed you no matter what, probably. So you do a few interviews, you eat lunch, you do a few more interviews. Lunch is typically also kind of part of your interview process because people are just getting to know you, and for whatever it's worth, ensuring that they want to have you around. And of course, it's your chance to make sure you want to be around those people as well. In terms of what those interviews look like, if you're a little more junior, it's probably going to be more stuff like you saw in the technical phone screen. There may be a product portion as well, especially if the company is a little smaller. That may matter a lot more because when you're a smaller company like us, you really care about your engineers being able to have what's called product sense. So this idea of if there's no product manager or somebody that's touching a product more closely than engineering telling you what to do, are you going to be able to make good decisions? Are you going to be able to prioritize? If you're not given like a perfect spec where it says exactly where to put each pixel and what to build, like, can you figure that out if somebody just gives you a very vague set of directions? And startups really value those people, because in a startup, everything's a giant shit show and nobody knows anything. So the more independent you can be without needing a lot of guidance, the better of an employee you will be to that company. There may be interviews that are explicitly about culture fit, where they'll try to suss out what you would do in certain situations. It depends on the company. At the end, there may be an interview with a founder if it's a startup, especially if you did well, because then the founder is going to be trying to sell you. That's generally a good sign, but at the end of the day, you go home and hopefully one way or the other, you hear back, and either you get on the phone with a recruiter afterwards and get a job offer, or you dust yourself off and move on and start over.
That's an excellent overview. That's a great synopsis. And I love that you touched on both the super technical parts of that and the human parts of that, how the lunch interview is part of the interview, right? So you're being judged and you're judging them throughout the entire day. So it's a good heads up that you should be paying attention and putting your best foot forward in every situation. Plenty of people have done things outside of the company where it got back that you really acted like a jerk before you even walked in the door. And that's not like you're being judged the entire time. So
everyone's watching you the whole time.
Yep. So based on that overview and your extensive experience, what do you see as some of the most common pitfalls in both the technical and the engineering space for interviews?
Yeah, so my world is the technical phone screen. I kind of live and breathe that stuff. I'm not that good at being an interviewee. Actually, I went on our platform last year as an interviewee to like dog food, like test out our own stuff, and I bombed miserably. So that interview is there somewhere. I haven't listened to it since, but it's bad. But I'm a pretty decent interviewer now, and the main reason I live and breathe this stuff is because that is all Interviewing IO does, is just focus on that part of the process. At this point, we've amassed about 20,000 interviews, both practice interviews and real interviews with companies. So a lot of what I say isn't going to be my opinion. Some of it will be my opinion, but some of it is going to be like stuff that we actually saw. So pitfalls. Number one pitfall, and this is general, and I'll like give specific examples as well, is just lack of preparation. People think a lot of the time, especially novices, that if you can code, you're going to do well in technical interviewing. That's just not true, and it's unfortunate. Technical interviewing is a proxy. Like a resume is kind of a proxy for what you can do, but it's a bad one. Interviews are also a proxy for what you can do. They're better than a resume. That's kind of what I've bought into in my whole life now, so I kind of have to believe it, but they are better. They're not perfect though. The motivation for interviews being the way they are, and this isn't really the best reason, but like a lot of companies try to have a process that they can scale up, and then they can just swap in different interviewers. Like a company like Google has a process that a lot of companies copy. So the idea is like you can train interviewers really fast, you can swap one in for the other, and you can just have the same thing, and it's easy to scale up. So the stuff that you're going to be doing in an interview is not necessarily the stuff you're going to be doing when you're writing code on a day-to-day basis, or when you're building, or when you're working on the projects that you're doing for your Udacity nano degrees or otherwise. It's going to be a very different kind of coding and a different kind of thinking. And some of it isn't bad, because the idea is like, hey, we can level the playing field, and if we ask people these questions that gauge their kind of engineering and problem solving ability, that's going to be better than asking them domain-specific questions that they may not know. But the downside is you have to practice for these kinds of interviews in a way that you probably haven't had to before. Even senior people have to de-rust, because you don't do this stuff on the job. And then if you haven't been in it in a few years, you have to go back and get used to it. So just like assuming that just because you're a good coder means that you're going to be a good interviewee is not true. Lack of preparation. Another thing, and this is just a basic issue that we see all the time, is people will choose a programming language to interview in that they're not super comfortable in. And some of them will choose these erudite languages that they're trying to show off, like, oh, look, I know functional programming, I'm going to interview in like Erlang or something. It's like, well, why? Because you're not going to be able to do the things you need to do. A lot of technical interviews require you to manipulate arrays or strings, right? So if you do know a language where it's easy to do that, and you know it well, you should probably pick that. Some people will choose C and then they forget how to instantiate an array in it, or instantiate a hash table or something, and that's a problem. Other things like just basic, there are these building blocks that come up over and over in all technical interviews, like knowing how to deal with a hash table or a dictionary, right? Knowing how to iterate through an array, knowing how to manipulate strings, knowing like whether strings are mutable or immutable in that language. These are things that should, like, somebody should be able to wake you up in the middle of the night, just shake you awake and be like, you know, write a for loop, and you should be able to do it in the language of your choice, like while you're still half asleep. And if you can't do that, you're probably not ready. Another mistake is not talking at all or talking too much. So everyone kind of knows that in a technical interview, you're supposed to articulate your thoughts. So your interviewer can know what you're thinking. And then even if you don't solve the problem perfectly, at least they get some taste for the fact that you can think like logically A to B and that you're smart. That's good. It's a good approach, and you should talk. So you shouldn't sit there quietly for a long time. However, especially junior people, I've seen do this a lot. They'll just like talk nonstop, and it's just this verbal diarrhea that doesn't actually carry any signal. So like, I'm declaring this variable, and now here's a for loop, and every time the loop, you know, every time there's one iteration of the loop, I'm going to increment my counter. And it's like, yes, of course. That's like saying, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to walk and I'm going to put one foot in front. Yeah, but I don't care. I want to know where you're going and like why you chose to go there. I'll stop here because I think I ranted through a lot of common errors, but I hope that helps. And if I think of others, I'll intersperse them.
They were fantastic. So to recap, what I heard you say was, number one, practice, practice, practice. Number two, don't wing it. And number three, stick to what you know. And when you know it, articulate that in a way that's focused on results and not just the minute steps in between the way. So I think all super helpful advice. So you talked about someone who might be novice and maybe the dialogue being a little more nervous. And so what advice do you have for someone who's just starting out?
Yeah. So I think first you just have to accept, I'm going to misquote, like, I really like this Winston Churchill quote about like, if you're walking through hell, like keep going. If you're going, like, you have to accept that you're going to be like walking through hell for a few months. There are no shortcuts here. If you've studied math, there might be some shortcuts for you because you're already used to this kind of thinking. If you've done a lot of proofs, or if you've done discrete math, stuff like that, if you're used to flipping coins and dice and, you know, probabilities, you have a leg up. But if you don't, that's okay. But it means that, you know, you're going to have to embrace the fact that there will be a series of steps that you have to take to prepare. So the first step is just getting comfortable with the material. So, you know, understanding data structures, like knowing what they are, and not just like memorizing stuff, but really getting how they work under the hood. Like, what does this thing do when it allocates memory? Like how much, like what, how does it use memory? Why do people use it? Why does this exist in the first place? Things like that, like really understanding what they are and the differences between them. After that, you know, just working through, I think there are maybe like 5 broad categories of technical interviewing problems you're going to see out in the wild, and just like working a ton of problems on your own time. And this is before you practice with your friends. This is certainly before you, you know, if you use any kind of mock interviewing service, whether it's ours, which is free, or somebody else's, which, you know, may be or may not be free. Before you do any of that, you should work problems on your own, because until you're comfortable doing that, you're not going to be good at it with somebody breathing down your neck. Like you're going to freeze and you're going to sweat from parts of your body you like didn't know you could sweat from, and it's like really uncomfortable, and your brain just like doesn't work, and that's okay. But and then you won't be able to think anyway. But before you put yourself in that position, you should be able to solve these problems in a comfortable, relaxed setting, and you should understand the solutions. I also think it's really important, you know, just like when you do problem sets in school for any domain, like you have to suffer a little bit and you have to go down some dark alleys and come back out and make some mistakes. So that part of your brain forms the right wrinkles, because if you just look at the solution, it's not going to be the same. And that's going to take time. And it's frustrating because you don't know how long it's going to take. It might take you way longer than it takes other people. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're a bad coder. It just means like you have to learn to parallel park, and you have to keep practicing parallel parking until you get it right. Once you basically worked, I don't know, like 40 or 50 problems. And by the way, there's an amazing, I'll plug this in case it's useful. There's a site called, well, there are a few. One is LeetCode, which a lot of you probably know about. I think that one's free. Then there is a site called Interview Cake. That one is not free, but I don't think it's too bad price-wise. And there's like a refund if you're not happy, I think. A friend of mine owns it, but we are big fans of Interview Cake because not only does it have a nice corpus of very realistic interview problems, it'll sort of hold your hand through those problems. So you can start working a problem and then the system will say, hey, like, do you know how to solve it? And then you'll say, yeah. And then the system will come back and say, okay, but is your solution in linear time? And then you'll be like, shit, no, it's in n squared or whatever. And then you'll say, no, it's not. Okay, well then think about this. So it'll just gently hold your hand and give you a series of hints that really mimic what a good seasoned interviewer would do, except no one's judging you because it's a computer. So, you know, like work through that entire set of problems, get really comfortable. Of course, cracking the coding interview is something everyone recommends, and there's a reason for that. It's a good book. But once you've done all of that, then you should practice with another person, and it's going to feel different and you're going to mess it up, and then you're going to get used to it. You should also, eventually you can practice talking out loud and getting that right mix of like sharing your problem solving acumen while not over talking. But I wouldn't worry about the mechanics and the artistry of technical interviewing until you've nailed the fundamentals. And that means just solve the problems, whether you're quiet or you're doing it on a whiteboard or on a computer, doesn't just solve them somehow. And then you can start building up the style.
Awesome. So you talk about solving those problems in your head first and just learning how and authentically learning the material. Let's talk a little bit about the dialogue in your head. How do you think you can best overcome maybe the dialogue of imposter syndrome or the negative thoughts that creep into your head when you're nervous and you're in a high pressure situation in an interview that none of us are necessarily used to being in all of the time?
Yeah. Well, the best way, of course, is preparation. Once you've prepared, you'll feel better. But of course, even people that are, and this is, I'm glad you asked about imposter syndrome. I'm actually working on a new blog post for Interviewing.io right now, where I've been looking at what imposter syndrome manifests as and which people on our platform are most susceptible to it. And what we found is, and I haven't written about this yet, and all of this might be wrong because I still have to go back and check the math, but I think some of this is right. So the better you are, the more likely you are to suffer from imposter syndrome. There's a very, very strong relationship. Experience, though, the more experienced you are, both the further along you are in your career and the more interviews you've done, of course, those are related as well, the better you will be at mitigating it. So if you've never done it before and you're good, you're in the worst position possible because you're going to think you're the worst. So if you're really good at this and you're junior, you probably think you're the worst. Our data says you're probably not the worst. But beyond practice, another thing that I think you can do is just put yourself in situations where you know you'll fail. And then you'll see it's not so bad. Once you've tasted failure, you kind of get used to it and you go numb a little, and it's okay, right? What a lot of people do is and this is part of the reason Interviewing.io exists, is because we're trying to make it so people don't have to do that. But people will often go and interview at companies they're not necessarily that excited about to warm up before they go and talk to their number one and number two choices. And messing up there, it might be one of the best things that ever happens to you, because then you know that it's not the end of the world. But really the best thing you can do is prepare to the point where, even though you'll always be plagued by feelings of inadequacy and kind of hating yourself, you get to the point where it's still there, but it's not the first thing in your mind, right? And you just soldier on and get through it. And that's really the best place you can be.
So it sounds like, well, it sounds like that's also a great benefit from working with a company like interviewing.io, because you get that external validation from another source. It's not just you constantly talking inside of your own head of what I do know or what I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that the imposter syndrome can be particularly acute for someone who's changing careers, because you're coming from something completely different and then you're moving into a new career. Do you have any specific tips for someone who's making a career change, perhaps even especially someone who's coming from a non-technical field and breaking into tech, to validate that, yes, I really am ready? Or how do you know when you're ready?
Yeah, I guess like technical interviewing is hard in large part, as you said, because you don't know how you're doing. There's really no feedback loop out in the wild. And unless you really, really do poorly and you can't get through a problem, in many cases, you'll think you did well and then you did poorly. Or I mean, we saw like there's not that much correspondence between how well people think they do and how well they actually did, whether it's chronic imposter syndrome or a one-off, or them overestimating their performance, which also happens. On our platform, if you do use it, you will actually get a percentile. So you get some idea of where you stack up, and I hope that will help. You have to do enough interviews for our system to be confident assigning you a percentile, but it's like 2 or 3 in many cases. For career changers, I think one of the hardest things, and we talk a lot about interview prep, but especially for career changers, I think one of the big challenges before they even get to show what they can do is getting their foot in the door. Is kind of getting past the resume screen, getting to the point where they even get to do a technical interview. One thing that I would recommend there for those people, and really for anybody junior, but especially for career changers that are not part of like the new grad and intern hiring pool, which has a very set process. If you're getting hired into industry and you're not part of the university recruiting funnel, you should do everything you can to network. So don't, especially for people like you, don't really rely on applying online. Instead, try to find people at the companies where you want to work and reach out to them directly and really hustle. And it sucks that you have to do that, but you kind of have to do that. Now, if you're a few years into your career, the good news is, especially if you're coming from a business field, you're probably going to be better at this than someone who hasn't done businessy kinds of things before. So, if a company has a blog that you enjoy, see who wrote like your favorite post and maybe reach out to them and say, I really enjoyed your work. I would love to do the kinds of things you're doing. Here are some projects that I've done. Do you have any advice for me? Or even better, if you can ask a specific question, not just general advice, but I've been thinking about this and I've run into this problem, and you are a subject matter expert because you wrote this thing I thought was really cool. Can we talk about it? Generally, people are really impressed when someone cares about something, because most people don't care about anything ever. So if you can sell yourself as somebody that's genuinely interested in the work and genuinely interested in getting better, I think you will have no trouble getting FaceTime with these people. And then hopefully they'll, even if they don't refer you in, they'll be able to make some intros for you and point you to people who can help you in some way. I would also advise not necessarily reaching out to recruiters at companies, because they have very tight quotas and they're busy. And 2, they generally, and this is not true for all recruiters, but a lot of them are not subject matter experts. So they are trained to look for a very specific thing, and they're looking at a pool of people to which you don't pertain because you're an outlier. So if you treat yourself as an outlier, it means that you can't do things that people that aren't outliers have to do. So like, find somebody that's actually doing the work you want to do and connect with them about the work, and finding people's emails is easy. You should be able to do that. So that's really my first piece of advice. And if you're a career changer, you've probably dealt with failure at some point in your career before, and this is no different. The mechanics are different, but you just have to take some time and get good at the things that
power through it, right? Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. What about, we talked about tech. I know your zone of genius is the technical interview, but what about adjacent tech interviews? Like people that are looking to be a product manager or something that's not necessarily a coder, but it's definitely a tech interview because you're working in the tech industry. Do you have any tips specifically for those people?
Yeah, I know a lot less about those, but I can venture to make a guess. So product management interviews are a little different than standard technical interviews because you're not writing code most of the time unless you're a technical product manager. I think it's a technical project manager at Microsoft or something. There are a few other titles where you're a PM, but you're also writing code. Those interviews are going to be sussing out your ability to think about product, to prioritize, to design. And they're also going to be sussing out, and this is, I think, the piece I can speak to most, having been on the giving end of some of these, just by virtue of my job. If you're hiring somebody that you want to have product sense, you want to know that they care about the space that you're in, right? Maybe like, they don't have to know everything about it, but if you're applying to a company that does something and you're applying for a product role, if at all possible, if it's an enterprise or, you know, it's a B2B company, maybe you don't have the chance to try the product, although, you know, I'd still encourage you to try to get a demo from someone. But if it's a B2C company and they're making some app or some other consumer product, there's no excuse for you not having tried it, played with it, and made notes on how it could be better. There's no excuse for you not knowing who their target demographics are, right? Or kind of the history of the product or how it's evolved. And, you know, you should, especially if you're a burgeoning product manager, get in the habit of reading tech periodicals. Some of them are boring and dry and soulless, but, you know, and some of them are just like wrong, but it doesn't matter. Like you have to see what people are doing in this space. Think about why they're doing it. Think about why company X failed, why company Y succeeded. Sometimes it has nothing to do with product, but a lot of the time it does, right? Certainly for a product role, you should be familiar with the competitors in the space, right? And you should be able to think about it in a kind of a matrixy fashion. This is also true in fundraising, right? So like think, what are the two axes? Where's the company you're applying? Where is everybody else? How are they different? And a lot of the stuff that you think could be wrong, and it doesn't matter, you just have to have, and you're not going to have a lot of the proprietary knowledge that you need to be right about these things, but you have to have thought about it. So like if you haven't thought about that stuff, it's a huge, huge red flag. And you should be able to come in and also talk about what's a product that you like and how would you, it doesn't even matter if it's related to the place you're interviewing, and how would you make that product better? And why haven't they done that?
So it sounds like the common theme there is preparation. So you're saying do your homework, be prepared, and come in being able to demonstrate that you can do the exact job that you're interviewing for because you thought about these things before.
One of the differences, that's a great point. One of the differences I think between product interviews, which I know a lot less about, and technical interviews, is that product interviews are much more closely aligned with the day-to-day work, whereas technical interviews are one level abstracted away. And chances are you might not be dealing with the day-to-day. Though some of the best interviewers, and we wrote a blog post about, so on our platform, people review interviewers just as much as interviewers review candidates. And candidates even review interviewers in real interviews. So if you interview with a company on our platform, you'll still be reviewing the quality of their questions and the individual interviewer's ability to walk you through the problem and stuff like that. So the best interviewers are people that have questions that do draw on real world stuff, right? So, you know, if you run a giant MOOC, right, and you have a chat room and you're trying to predict which students might be at risk of attrition or leaving, you know, then how would you code that up? Like what data would you look at? Like questions like that are really cool if you're at a company like Udacity. I just pulled that out of thin air, but like they also give the candidates some preview into what working there is like and what kinds of questions you're going to be thinking about on a daily basis, but not all companies do that. Whereas for product, you kind of have to. And there aren't as many, I think, people trying to get into product as eng, so it also changes the mechanics and kind of the dynamic of the interview. But I could be wrong about that. I actually don't know.
Well, let's navigate back towards your zone of genius here of the technical interview, but let's capitalize on that data transition that you just made there. So are there any particular differences between the different areas of tech interviews, such as someone who's in data science, someone who's in machine learning, someone who's in Android, so are there specific tips that you might have for any of those fields that would help them stand out?
I'll talk a little bit about mobile and a little less about machine learning and data science because I know less about those things. Depending on, this is not going to, by the way, I should have made this disclaimer earlier. A lot of the stuff that I say is not going to hold true for every company you speak to. Some companies don't subscribe to the technical interview algorithmic format at all. They just don't buy into it. They do other things. Some of them make you do a project, which I'm kind of behind as long as that project doesn't take like 50 hours. It's a whole other complicated rat's nest, but the idea is that like your mileage is probably going to vary. One of the trends that I've seen that said in mobile interviews is companies have a hard time finding mobile engineers that aren't just mobile engineers. So it's not that hard to build an app. That's not necessarily engineering work. Whereas being an engineer first, and then also knowing Objective-C or Swift, or being familiar with developing for Android, it's not the same. So top companies will often look for people that are engineers first, and then have also done mobile, rather than just people that have shipped a bunch of apps, but don't have the classical training and don't think in the context of computer science fundamentals. So if you're a mobile engineer and you're applying to one of these companies that buys into this interview style, I would say it's extra important for you to be well prepared with traditional algorithmic interviews, as well as being able to demonstrate proficiency in your domain specific, language of choice and platform of choice.
Very helpful. What should I say if I'm in an interview and I don't know the answer? I mean, it happens to everyone. What's the best way to respond to that?
Yeah, well, if you've prepared, you will hopefully be able to contextualize the question and put it into one of those broad 5 or so categories of question. So you can say, you know what, this sounds like a question where hash tables would be helpful, right? And doesn't even have to be true, but at least you're kind of, and then you explain why you think that. So try to put the question in a category. And then after that, one thing that helps too is asking the interviewer, or if they have it, or maybe you even come up with your own test case, right? Just come up with some inputs and then walk through the problem and make sure you understand what the outputs have to be. And then you should, if you don't know what to do, often problems have what's called a brute force solution. So there you're not doing anything elegant or clever. You're just let's say you have to compare a number to every other number or something, right, in a list. Well, then, okay, you just make 2 for loops and you just kind of go through it, and it's not going to be very elegant, but you did it. So just like think of what the brute force solution would be and do that first. If you just do that, you're probably not going to get the job. You're going to have to start optimizing it and start getting a little bit more clever with your solution. But that's the first thing. And while you're doing that, your brain will be working in overdrive, and you'll probably figure out some stuff you can do. I wouldn't advise asking the interviewer for hints. Generally, you want them to give hints to you. But you can tell them about a few different approaches you're thinking about. You can tell them what you don't think will work. It's okay to say what comes to mind, and just, if nothing else, just try to get through a test case and come up with a brute force.
So when you talked about the brute force, you talked about doing a simple type solution and then building on that. It's a common interviewing technique that people use, often the layered complexity. Can you tell us a little bit about that type of an interview and how you should address questions or interviews that take the format of layered complexity?
Yeah, you may not even know that that's what's happening. A lot of the time, and generally good interviewers will do this. They will start with a problem that feels pretty simple. And it's kind of nice because it's a way for you to warm up and get comfortable and, start coding. And then they'll start changing it up a little bit, or just adding stuff. And what started as a pretty simple array traversal might end up being some kind of multi-threaded monster across a few different machines. But the idea is with these problems that, there are different tiers, and maybe a junior candidate will get through like steps 1, 2, 3, and then a more senior one will get through 4. And then, some exceptional candidate might make it to the point where the interviewer runs out of questions, and then the two of them are just kind of spitballing together and having fun, which you hope every interview ends that way, where you and the interviewer just feel like you're collaborating on something, because hopefully it's a preview of collaborating with the people here that are interviewing with you on something, because that's your job. But a lot of the time, people think that this is kind of, so I think they did well just because they solved everything an interviewer gave them, but sometimes there was more and you just ran out of time and the interviewer didn't tell you that. So that can happen. On the flip side though, sometimes people think they did really, really poorly because they got through like steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the interviewer, and so they're already like passing with flying colors, and then the interviewer introduces step 6 just for funsies, and then you don't get all the way through step 6, and then you walk out of there thinking, oh, I'm a failure, when you actually performed and, you know, among the best performers that saw that problem. So you never know. That's one of the things that's hard about interviewing, and Jane, you mentioned this earlier, it's just like you don't know how you did, but that can happen. And if a company is interviewing you that way, chances are they're good, because coming up with those questions takes time and effort, and it means that they care about the process and about candidates. It's not just some like vanilla problem they saw in a book and then they just asked you. This is something that they've put effort into layering. So I would say it's a good sign, and it's not everything, but it should tell you, it should make you feel like you're talking to someone that cares.
And they're also looking for someone who can solve higher level problems, not just someone who can just give a rote answer, which is awesome. And the interview you talked about where it is an interchange, aside from being productive, it's fun, right? So that's a good thing when you can come away from an interview that's fun. That's always positive. You mentioned earlier the 5 categories of questions, and we've had some questions on the chat asking if you could elaborate a little upon those 5 categories and talk about them.
So, you know, one is, and I'm probably not going to be able to list all 5 because it's been a while since I've written code, but like one would be, okay, you'd use a hash table for this problem, right? Another one is you'd use a tree. These are just examples. Another one, this is a kind of program that would necessitate dynamic programming, or, you know, maybe recursion. Just categories like that, right? So I'm trying to think of other examples. Sometimes, you know, it's a problem that requires you to sort in some clever way, but just like knowing how to apply, when to apply these very basic techniques. When would a hash table be beneficial? Whereas like, when is recursion the right thing to do? Just things like that.
So honestly, if people go to lead code and interview code, I think they'll find the answers to these, and they're just the common technical. It's basically knowing the language and the basics. And if you don't know these 5 basic type things, you're not ready to branch out anyway. So keep on practicing, I think, is what you're saying.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So we talked about a bunch of different types of things with networking, moving into different jobs. What are some of, when you talk about different companies and how they interview in different ways, what are some of the most surprising things you've come across in the data after looking at over 20,000 interviews? What has jumped out at you, either from interviewees, interviewers, or companies that surprised you in the data?
All right, I have a lot, so just stop me. I'll mention this one because this is Udacity. A while ago, this is, I think, back when we just had 3,000 interviews, we looked to see what traits some of our top performing candidates had in common. So we looked at things like where they went to school. I'll tell you exactly what we looked at. Here we go. So yeah, we looked at where people went to school. We looked at their seniority, whether they had founded a startup, whether they had a master's degree, whether they worked at a top company previously. And we also looked at whether people had taken classes on Udacity and or Coursera. And what we found, and this was super surprising to me, there are only 3 things that ended up mattering. One, and this is the one that mattered the most, was whether people had actively been involved in computer science related MOOCs. So that mattered more than where they worked before and where they went to school. And that was like really encouraging, because to me, that means, you know, your career is not set in stone at any point, and you can always make a shift and better your situation. So that was really cool. Another thing we found that was really surprising is we looked at just college students and their interview performance. And we looked at that sort of as a function of where they had gone to school, where they were still enrolled, and whether they were in a top school or maybe like an elite school, so like the MITs and the Stanfords of the world and such, and then top 10 schools, and you know, the top 15 or top 20, and then finally everybody else, or maybe it was top 15, top 50, everyone else. We found that after having administered a very basic, very quick, like 5 to 10 minute coding challenge, any disparity in how people performed in interviews wasn't significant. So there was no difference in how people did in technical interviews, regardless of where they went to school. Once if you could do well on a basic task, nothing else mattered. So that was really encouraging for us as well. Trying to think, another really surprising thing, or somewhat surprising, was that we built voice modulation technology. We actually now have a patent on it, where in real time we could make women sound like men and men sound like women. And we ran an experiment where we made people sound like the other gender in practice interviews, and then tried to see if that materially changed their performance. So you might think if we make a woman sound like a man, she sounding like a he is going to get better ratings than she did sounding like a woman, and maybe vice versa. We saw that actually didn't happen. So on our platform, gender did not make a difference. What was really, really interesting though is on average, women were performing significantly worse than men. So this was kind of weird because I don't want to believe that women are worse at computers, but I was ready to accept it, like if we got more data. But I dug into it a little more, and what ended up happening, and this was like really surprising, is once you corrected, so women left our platform 7 times more often after a bad interview, like one bad interview, as men did. So once you corrected for people leaving after their first bad interview, any performance disparity went away entirely. So women tend to get discouraged and leave much more often than men, but if they stay, they're just as good. There's no difference.
That's awesome. So conquer that imposter syndrome and the tenacity to say failure is a learning experience, not an intrinsic shortcoming on my part. Sounds like it's the secret to breaking down the gender barriers that are plaguing tech in general. So that's what a powerful message for us to get across to women in underrepresented groups everywhere, right? To just say that first failure doesn't mean you're not good enough. Everybody fails.
That's right. And as we look at imposter syndrome, one of the things we saw is that there's no difference between men and women when they're not performing well, but when they're performing well, women are affected by it more acutely.
That's awesome. What about company-wise? Do you see any interesting insights between companies or across companies and how they interview? Are there any that are radically different than others?
We haven't really noticed a big change, but the companies that tend to be our customers are the ones that buy into this, very standard interview style. So I think that, for this style, it's kind of standard across the board. We did look at where people worked. So I was thinking if somebody works at a top company, maybe they're going to have less imposter syndrome than somebody that doesn't. Or if they work for a well-funded company, or looked at company revenue, like all these proxies for company brand, doesn't matter. People from small companies feel it just as much as people from big ones. And I also thought maybe if you work at a top company, you'll feel it more because in theory, you're surrounded by like all these exceptional people. No, everybody just kind of feels it. If they're good, it doesn't matter where they are.
Yep. The great equalizer. So let's assume that everyone has followed your advice. I've prepared like crazy. I'm ready for it. I've prepared. I've practiced. I've gone through my own head, practice friends finally, and I've gotten good enough that now I've joined interviewing.io and I'm ready for a more intense level of practice. My skills are up to par, my practice is up to par, and guess what? I've gotten the job. I've got an offer on the table. Now it's time to negotiate. First celebrate, and then it's time to negotiate. So do you have any tips on what to say? First of all, you mentioned that you'd circle back to this. So what do you say when they say, what's your price? And what don't you say? And then after that, what are some great tips for negotiating the best offer that you can get?
Yeah. Can you still see me? I'm looking at some like stuff I wrote out, just looking at some notes.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, wonderful. If it looks like I'm reading stuff, it's because I'm reading stuff. So a lot of the time, and I mentioned earlier, I'd circle back, and you're going to be in a call with a recruiter very early on in the process. So this is going to be before you get to know much about the company. It's going to be certainly before you get an offer, before you get to know the team. They're going to be asking you what your comp expectations are in many cases. This to me seems a little weird. I hated doing it when I was a recruiter, so I just stopped doing it. I just believe that you don't know what an opportunity is worth to you until you've sussed it out a little better. And you certainly don't know early on in your, especially if this is your first job search, you don't know anything. So you shouldn't say anything because you don't know. One of the things that really is unfortunate about this too is that this practice, I think, is a carryover from the days when salary variance was a lot higher. At this point, companies know pretty well what they can pay you and what they can't, especially at the junior level. So them asking you this doesn't really change anything, except it's not going to get you anything to say a number, it'll just hurt you. So here is what I advise people say, and I have some slides on this because I give a guest lecture on negotiation every semester at MIT. I'm very fortunate to do that, and they're just as scared of it as everybody else. So this is verbatim, like what I would tell you guys to say. At this point, I don't feel equipped to throw out a number because I'd like to find out more about the opportunity first. Right now, I simply don't have the data to be able to say something concrete. If you end up making me an offer, and this is the part that matters here, I would be more than happy to iterate on it if needed and figure out something that works. I also promise not to accept other offers until I have a chance to discuss them with you. So they might tell you like, oh, you have to tell us what your expectations are because this way it'll keep you in the running. We'll say, look, I'm gonna be a decent person. I'm gonna make sure that I'm transparent. I'm gonna tell you what's going on. I'm not gonna drop out of the process until discussing it, if it even comes to that. And also say that I am sure that my expectations would not rule me out as a candidate because for the right job, it's not just about money, right? The only time this actually materially matters is like if you're trying to hire a very senior person from one of the big 5 companies and they're making like $500,000 and you have a tiny startup that can't pay more than 90K. Like that might be a deal breaker, and they have a house and a mortgage and then they can't take your job. In most cases, that is not the problem. So don't be fooled into thinking that it is. Does that make sense?
It makes tremendous sense. And I think it's a great offer, a great response, because it touches on the fact that you're not doing this out of disrespect for them, but out of respect for the process by saying, I want to be fair, but I also don't have enough information to come back with a response, but I'm also not using that to treat you unfairly. So it's great. What I do think is that everyone would like to have that can you give us that verbatim that we can share with everyone afterwards?
I can just throw this into the chat, but I'll also give you guys.
That would be amazing if you could do that. I think everybody would love to be able to capitalize off of that.
You are now all powerful.
This is wonderful. Thank you. Oh, look at that. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. So now we've talked about what to say when they ask us for the number. What about when they start to throw out the number and it's time to negotiate that number from that point? What do you do then?
Yeah, so the best thing to do is to just have multiple offers, right? It's what's the term? Like, I don't know negotiation theory. I'm kind of a very practical person. I've learned this myself through failing a lot, but the best leverage you can have is to just have more than one offer. So that means that you kind of have to be strategic in how you approach your job search. So let's say you're applying to Google, and I don't remember how long it takes to get through their process, but it's months, right? So don't quote me on this. Sorry, Google, I don't know exactly how long it takes, but let's say it's like 2 months. That means that you, of course, you don't want to go to Google as your first date when you haven't been on the dating scene in a while. You probably want to, date some, right? But kind of warm back up as we discussed. But once you're ready, you should probably do that earlier. Right? And then smaller startups, and you can also kind of look at, if you go on LinkedIn, you can see how big a company's engineering team is and how big their recruiting team is. And those can be a proxy for how quickly they can move. Also, I don't know if this is on Glassdoor, just like how long it takes, but try to time it so you're getting the really small companies that you're excited about toward the end, and you've started the process with some bigger ones at the beginning. One thing, I just love the chat window open. I think it's now illegal, at least in California, for companies to ask your salary, your current salary up front. They can still ask you about your expectations, but you don't have to reveal your current salary. I don't know how it is in other states, but in California, you don't have to, and you shouldn't anyway. Like, nobody would ever force you, but like now it's kind of illegal to ask that. But yeah, have multiple offers if you can. And very likely you can. Now, even if you don't have multiple offers, you can use upcoming on-sites as leverage. So if you tell a company that you have an on-site coming up with Google or with Facebook or one of these companies, but maybe you're willing to drop out if this is I call this the reverse used car salesman. So let me see, I have like wording for this too. I love talking about negotiation. Okay, so this is so if you have multiple offers, by the way, I'll talk about that and then I'll come back to the reverse used car salesman. If you have multiple offers, you don't have to reveal the details of those offers, especially if they're not favorable, right? So if all your offers are pretty low and crappy and you're trying to get more money from a company, you can just say, I have offers from X, Y, and Z, and I'm not going to reveal the details, but one of these offers is more equity heavy and one is more cash heavy, and you can paint broad strokes and you don't ever have to reveal the details. That said, so be strategic about it, right? If you have a great offer, yeah, of course, like tell them I have this offer for like $50 billion from this company, and you can tell them that they don't have to match it, but of course, like it would be nice, and you can reveal what will be favorable to you, but you don't always have to show all your cards, and that's perfectly fine. By the way, anything you do, recruiters have seen like 1,000 times before, and unless you're a giant jerk, or unless you're applying for a position where like literally the head count for that position is 1 and they just need to fill it, your offer will not be rescinded for negotiation. If it's a tiny company, or if it's like a college situation and they just have like only so many new grads or only so many interns they're going to hire, yeah, like maybe it'll get rescinded, or maybe like if you don't move fast enough or accept fast enough, you won't get it. But in big companies, they're hiring all the time. There's just a hamster wheel and they're just constantly hiring. So unless you're a giant jerk, your offers won't be rescinded. So the reverse used car salesman. Okay, so you can say something like this. I have the following offers, if you have offers. Don't lie, because recruiting is a very small community and people do back channel, so don't lie about stuff. But I have the following offers, and I'm still interviewing at company X and company Y, but I'm really excited about this opportunity and will drop my other stuff and sign today. This is why it's called the reverse used car salesman. If you and then you ask for 3 things. So I typically recommend asking for an equity increase, a salary increase, and then a signing bonus or a relocation bonus if you're moving and they haven't offered that yet. So here, I can paste this in as well, but I'll get Jane the slides afterwards.
This is wonderful. So you're creating both the value and the desire, and then the urgency, so that they close the deal, and then you actually add to it the final icing on the cake, which are the things that really will put you over the top. So those are fantastic.
You're not going to get all 3 ever, but you're going to get some portion of them. And I've never had a candidate, when I was when I was running my own recruiting firm, every time one of my candidates used this, they'd walk away with at least like an extra 10K somewhere. With equity, it depends on your comfort level, and it depends on the stage of the company, but you can potentially ask them to 1.5 times it. Maybe if you're feeling frisky, you can ask them to double it. With salary, it depends. Like you're going to have an idea of what's what there, but definitely with a signing bonus, if you don't have one, throw that in, and that's the easiest thing for companies to give, because it's a one-off, yep. Right? Salary, that they're stuck paying you.
The cost of sale at that point. It's just yep. So great advice. And for people who are listening, we have next week another webinar specifically dedicated toward figuring out these issues around equity and salary and how to negotiate those offers to the best of your advantage. So join us next week for that. We have 3 minutes left, and I want to make the best use of the time. And I'd like to explore a little bit more in depth. The advice you've given us today is phenomenal. I'm so grateful to you, Aline, but I'd like to explore a little bit more about how we can best in our whole community can best work with interviewing.io to get the most out of what you have to offer, and so that people come to prepare to succeed with what you have to offer. So if you can share a little bit more about what you think are the best steps to prepare, when to interact with your platform, and next steps for them to take forward from there.
Yeah, so we have an invite link that we give to Udacity, and I think you guys will be sharing it with the audience afterwards. Right now, and this is not awesome, I'm just going to be honest, right now interviewing.io is probably best suited for people that are already fairly comfortable with the technical interview process, and that often means that you've been working in industry for a few years and have gone through the ringer at least once before. The reason for that is you're just going to be thrown in the deep end. Right now, we don't have a lot of content. We don't have that much hand holding. So we're really, really good if you want to de-rust a little bit or kind of get that last piece of finesse. We're not as good if you've never done a technical interview. You'll probably just be frustrated because it's too early. I think first thing to do is practice using resources on your own, maybe practice with a friend, and then, you know, we can be part of the solution onwards. But we're working on it. We want to start helping people that are less familiar with the process as well, because you guys are going to change the shape of this industry. So like, we'd be stupid not to. And that's in progress. But if you already are familiar with technical interviewing and have worked in industry, please do sign up to our platform, and we hope that you'll get some amount of value out of it, either because you just got warmed up and then you get a job elsewhere, or maybe you'll get a job through us. It's kind of cool if you do well in practice. You just get to grab time slots with companies like Lyft. You just say, boom, I want to interview with Lyft tomorrow at noon. You have a guaranteed technical interview tomorrow at noon with a real Lyft engineer, and it's anonymous, so you can mess up. They won't know who you are. It's kind of cool.
That's amazing. That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that opportunity, for sharing all of your insights today. They've been practical, they've been actionable, and they've been tremendously insightful. Thank you so much.